great to see everyone here tonight. Welcome. I was a little bit afraid that the weather was going to scare people off, and I'm glad the snowflakes didn't really start coming down really hard till we were already on the road headed here. Because, as a speaker, you like to have, let's just face it, a big audience. And when you only have a few, well, then you're not as excited. That's just, I guess, human nature, I suppose. But I'm very glad you're here. Glad we're here. Now, I want to, as Alan kind of stated, I want to commend the congregation for the work during the young people's meeting. It was a fantastic meeting, and the congregation here really did a great job of feeding the multitude, so to speak. We really did have a lot of food, a lot of different things. As a matter of fact, Friday afternoon before the meeting, I came over here in my pickup truck and I picked up a lot of stuff, and part of that was 5 or 6 flats of water. And after the meeting, I drove over here and unloaded 7 or 8 flats of water. And the point I'm trying to make is you were so generous in making sure that our crowds were fed and had plenty of this, and especially plenty of water, that we wound up with more water than when we started with. Not that it wasn't a miraculous event or anything, it just the generosity in the caring of this congregation was fantastic. So appreciate that. And as Alan mentioned, Noah got up this morning, was heading out the door about 7 a.m., drove 10 hours. I think it rained on him pretty much the whole way to Brookhaven, but he's got a nice all-wheel drive Subaru, so that usually helps out quite a bit. And we're thankful he made it safely tonight. We pray he'll make it safely tomorrow. He's traveling with his dog. His dog's been living with us for the last 2 months. And he's a wonderful dog. I think I'll miss the dog as much as I miss Noah, because he's a great, nice, calm dog, and he's just a pleasure to be around. So just wanted to mention those few things. So, we missed last we missed last Wednesday night. And so 2 weeks ago, you might need a little bit of a reminder of what actually is going on in Acts the 14th chapter. So Bobby gave us spoke upon Acts the 13th chapter, and he broke that into 2 different sessions. And this again is Paul's first missionary journey, as it is called. And in the previous chapter, he was in Antioch, and of course, Bobby pointed out there's many different Antiochs. But so you kind of understand that there's different Antiochs, but he was in the Antioch up in this region, and this region is called different things at different times throughout the scriptures. Asia Minor is part of it, other terms, but this is modern day Turkey. So if you want to know where the earthquake happened, the terrible, terrible earthquake, it was actually probably closer over to this region right here. But so that kind of helps us understand it. This outline shows us the first missionary journey of this map, and how we talked about that, how they went to Perga, and Paul, the apostle, and the people who were traveling with him, they'd gone up to Antioch, and they went to the synagogue, and they preached there, the synagogue, the Jews, and they preached there, and it was somewhat received by some of the Jews and some of the Gentiles. And when we use the term Gentiles here, since Paul is preaching in a synagogue, it was probably what we would call proselytes, or Jews that had been converted to Judaism or whatnot. So just keep that in mind as we go along. So they were somewhat successful here, but there were Jews that were jealous of what was going on, and they pretty much turned the town officials against Paul, and they ran him out of town, or let's just say Paul got out of town, because they were going to stone him in Antioch. And so Paul and his group, they heard about this, and they decided, okay, we need to get out of here before they kill us. And so they did. And we can see from right here, they go down to this city of Iconium. Now, Iconium is, there's no longer really a city called Iconium in Turkey. There's another city that's taken its place. And but it was a pretty large city, a pretty large town. Now, there was an interesting fact that's been brought forth, and I just wanted to show you this, that in this area of Asia Minor, as it's described sometimes in the scriptures, the Romans had records of what went on in this area. And what I wanted to point out is the number of Jews that were in this area. Important evidence is contained in the distribution of the Jews in Asia Minor. It is believed that in the 2nd century BC, Jews were living in more than 50 cities in Anatolia, which is it's a region that is in Turkey, but obviously Turkey encompasses much more than this. According to the Roman tax documents of this period, there were approximately 45,000 male Jewish citizens in that region. So a tremendous population of Jewish people in that area of Asia Minor. Well, what were they doing there? How did they get there? Why weren't they in Jerusalem or Palestine or whatever you want to call it these days? Well, it has a lot to do with the Babylonian captivity. And I won't get into that, but I think most of us are aware that, at one point in time, the Jewish people got carried off to Babylon as prisoners, as slaves, and Jerusalem was destroyed. Not all of those Jews made it back, and after their captivity, some of them, there are historical documents that show us that some of them landed in this area right here, and they multiplied and spread their faith. And there's lots of historic evidence to support that. It's really not debatable. And so, just to kind of support this, we're all familiar with this town of Sardis, which is not part of Paul's missionary journey, but there is a Jewish synagogue from that time period that still stands. And this is an actual picture of it. It's impressive. And historians estimate that it could hold up to 1,000 worshipers at one time, and that there were probably up to 10,000 Jews that utilized the synagogue back in that time when Paul went through this area. So tremendous amount of Jews in Asia Minor in these areas. And so as Paul was accustomed to, where he had the most success, was when he came to a town or to a city, he went to the synagogue, because there were customs that if they didn't just let any visitor stand up and speak, but Paul had some credentials, if you will, of being a Jew from his Jewish heritage. And so when he went to these synagogues on the Sabbath, where they were gathered together and they were reading from the scriptures, it was not uncommon for a man such as Paul, a Jew such as Paul, to be recognized as a visitor and to be given an opportunity to speak. And of course, they were inviting him to speak from the scriptures and to, give a little exhortation from the scriptures. And he did that. And guess what he talked about? He talked about the Messiah and the fulfillment of the scriptures. And he taught Jesus was the fulfillment of that. And if you go back to previous chapter, verse 13, it gives his whole speech, his whole sermon, his whole spiel is contained there in chapter 13 that Bobby covered, and how he reasoned with prophecy, with the scriptures, that Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus was whom they were looking for, the Savior. And you can imagine that some of the Jews listened closely. It tells us that some believed, and even some of the Gentile proselytes believed, and they were excited to hear this because they could see in the scriptures, and Paul was proving it in the scriptures, that Jesus was whom they were looking for. But there were also those who didn't believe because they were being threatened. Their traditions were being threatened, and all they could think about probably was themselves and their future, and And they rejected this teaching, and it probably made them mad to see other people accepting it. This created a lot of turmoil in not only the synagogue, but in the communities, because these synagogues were a big part. And so we can read throughout the scriptures how the gospel, can cause separation, can cause turmoil, can cause a lot of things within when it is introduced into a community such as this, because some people will not accept it. So I just thought that was interesting to make note of that as we see that in chapter 14, how they had to, in chapter 13, they had to get out of town because there was a plot to kill them, and they realized that. So they wound up in Iconium. And so let's read there. In Iconium, starting in verse 1 of 14, it says, "Now it happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands." So let me back up again, and we've probably already stated this, but this missionary journey, we don't know how long it lasts, but it was at least a year, and it could have been up to 3 years that Paul was on this missionary journey. So that's a long time. So when we see statements in here that they say a certain amount of time, we don't really know how long it was that they stayed there and preached. But to get the results that they did, they probably stayed there 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe a couple of months, maybe 3 or 4 months, depending what city that they're in. It's unclear, but we see the results. The results were probably just more than one session, if you will. And maybe it was just one session in this rendering. But we see that it worked, and not only did they preach in the synagogue and give the scriptures, but they also were able to heal people. They were able to show signs and miracles to confirm that what they were saying was true. And that was not only important for the Jews, but it was also important for the Gentiles to see that too, and to confirm what they were saying, that this was God's plan. And so it says in verse 3, they stayed there a long time, and they were speaking boldly, and they were doing these signs and wonders. So here they are in Iconium, in the synagogue, and about town. And in verse 4, but the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews, and in part with the apostles. And then a violent attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with the rulers to abuse and stone them. And they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region. Now, previously I said that in Antioch there was a plot to stone them, but I think I got that mixed up. But anyway, they still had to leave Antioch, and so they got to Iconium, and here the Jews again were mad, and they went to the city leaders, and they probably said all sorts of false things about the apostles or about Paul, and probably told the leaders all sorts of lies and bad things. And so the leaders of the city, they want to get, again, Iconium is a fairly large city. They wanted to get rid of them. And they came up with a plot again to stone them. And it says here that verse 6, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia and in the surrounding region. So, again, the distance between Antioch and Iconium, if I remember correctly, was about 60 miles or maybe a little bit more. And that's a hard 2 days journey. But they came to Iconium and there was a plot there and they had to leave and they only traveled about 18 miles down to this little town of Lystra. And then also in these other verses, they traveled over here to Derbe. And these were both fairly small towns. If you look at a geographical representation of this area, this was kind of a high plateau area, but it was pretty flat and it was used for grazing for just about as far as you can see. And then there were some mountains over here and mountains over there, but these cities are no longer, these towns are no longer there today. They just completely were disappeared for the most part off the map. And historians tell us that there weren't a lot of Jews in these cities, or at least there probably wasn't an established synagogue. And so Paul and them, though, they preached to what we would call the Gentiles. And they talked with them about God's plan for them. Now, while they were there in Lystra, a certain man, in verse 8, without strength in his feet, was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leapt and walked. Now, again, Paul has the power to perform these miracles to confirm what he's saying is from God. And so he noticed this man, and it seems when it says this man had faith, this man, that basically means this man had believed what Paul was preaching, that Paul was from God and was listening to his words. And Paul observed him and observed he was lame and since birth in his feet, which lame in this context basically is he had no strength in his feet. And so he was healed. And, not that big of a deal for us because we read the Bible and we can see, all throughout the scriptures, the apostles healing people and Jesus healing people. We understand what that was for. But if you're a bunch of Gentiles running around in this town and these strangers come to your town and they perform this miraculous thing, if we were in their shoes, we'd probably freak out too. And that's what had happened in this town. They just went crazy in the sense that in verse 11 says, "Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, 'The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men.' And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes." So these Gentiles who were probably Greek, and they shared kind of the same gods as in other cultures, Zeus and Hermes, and they thought, man, these Paul and Barnabas are gods that have come down from the heavens because they saw this miraculous healing. And they were going to do what all they knew to do, and that was they were going to honor these gods, these men who they thought were gods, and they went and got the sacrifices ready. There was even a temple, to Zeus in that particular little town, and they were going to have a sacrifice and a big pagan stuff going on. And because that's what they knew to do when they thought the gods were among them. Now, apparently Paul and Barnabas didn't understand what was going on at first because these Laodiceans were speaking in a tongue they did not understand, and they're in a different language. But Paul and Barnabas started to figure out what was going on, and in verse 14, "But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, They tore their clothes, which is a Jewish expression of anguish, and ran among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all the things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness." And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. So again, Paul and Barnabas, they were just probably horrified that they were going to be worshipped with sacrifices and idols. And so they tried to put a stop to it, and Paul preached. He preached to the Gentiles. It says, there is a God, a one God, a living God. Those gods that you worship were made with the hands of men. They're idols. But the God that I worship is the one who made us and made creation and made all things. And you can see that. You can see it in nature. And nature is a witness. Creation is a witness to God. And these are the kind of things we can preach to people. You know, for example, when Jonathan Edwards went over to Cambodia, people over there, they never heard the name Jesus. Where do you even start to explain it? Well, this is one example of how you can preach and help people understand there's one God, and not the God not the little gods that we make or that they make with little idols. No, that's not right. And so Paul preached to these Gentiles, these Greeks, and so forth, that and reasoned with them, so to speak, and barely got them to stop what they were doing and listen to his sermon to them, as it tells us. Now, here's where things they just do a 180. Here are, in verse 18, then Jews from Antioch in Iconium show up, or came there. And having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Now, there's a lot of details left out of this, obviously, but we have enough details to understand what had happened. That these Jews who were feeling threatened in Antioch and Iconium, it wasn't just enough to run Paul and Barnabas out of town. They were going to follow them and make sure, or try to make sure, that they would stop preaching what they were preaching. And somehow they got the mob turned against Paul and Barnabas in the city of Lystra, and they stoned him. They stoned Paul to death. Now, stoning was maybe traditional is not the right word, but the traditional capital punishment of the Jews throughout time. And God lent to this. If somebody committed certain offenses, which we won't get into, if they were caught in the act, and there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses, if they were caught in the act of a capital offense, as we might say, such as adultery or murder, then they were to be put to death by stoning. And the witnesses who came forth to testify had to be the first ones to throw the stones. And we're not talking about little pebbles here. We're talking about this is stones big enough to really inflict injury. And this wasn't someone who they lined up against the wall like a firing squad. No, they had to get close enough to really do some injury. So this is the most decent picture I could find that represented this horrible death by stoning without being too graphic about it. So this was very personal. And so these Jews really had to work up the people in this town to turn so quickly, who they were ready to worship and bow down Paul and Barnabas, to turn around and stone Barnabas, or stone Paul, not Barnabas. And so, Paul writes about this in his readings, that he was once stoned. Well, this is what he was talking about. They left him for dead, and then they went on about their business, and a few of them even grabbed his body and drug it out to outside of the town and just cast it out and let happen whatever happened to the body. So it says in verse 19, then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Verse 20. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went to the city. And the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. Now, this is obviously miraculous that he could get up, and he was left for dead. God miraculously brought him back from and protected him, Paul. And so he went about his business the next day and left for Derbe. And it says there were disciples that came, not just Barnabas, but there were, apparently, they were able to convert some from the cities of Derbe and Lystra. Now, this is interesting. In Acts, the 16th chapter, verse 1. And this is talking about Timothy. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra. This is 16. This is referring to Paul's second missionary journey, reflecting back on the first missionary journey. And behold, a certain disciple was there, a disciple named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. So it would appear that Timothy and his family, or his mother and his grandmother, were converted to Christianity on Paul's first missionary journey. And if that's the case, they could have been the part of the group of disciples who came and found Paul's body. And then when Paul was revived, Timothy, this is conjecture, but it's very likely could have been part of that group that was there, or at least his mother and his grandmother. I found that terribly interesting. I didn't really think about that before. But the scriptures kind of support that. Timothy was from this area. These were two kind of small towns. And so take that with how you want to reflect upon it. We must move along. Verse 21. And when they had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. Okay, I threw in this picture of the ruins of Derbe because I found it interesting. So they believe this is the ruins of Derbe. This gives a representation of the kind of geographic surroundings of these two small towns out in the middle of these fields. So just wanted to share that with you. So let's go back to here because I got to hurry on. Here's Derbe. Here's Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas started their journey. Paul just got stoned, and then he went on to Derbe and he preached there. What's the shorter path back home? Well, the shorter path is to come down through here, through the mountain pass, and come to Tarsus, and then head on home. That would have been very easy, but no. Paul wanted to go back and check on the Christians, the new disciples. He's going to retrace his steps and go back to some of the cities where he was threatened because of his care and concern for the new disciples that are in those towns. And that's exactly what he does. He went he, in verse 22, strengthening the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. Paul knew about tribulations, didn't he? So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they have believed. Now let me say this. These were new congregations, yes. These were new disciples, but elders were established there. How is that possible, right? We think when you establish elders, they can't be a novice, that they can't be new converts, as we say. Well, keep in mind that they were probably Jews who had converted to Christianity, or as we should say, they believed in Jesus Christ. These were probably elders, men who were appointed that were religious men that had a long history of Old Testament scriptures, and they knew, and when they accepted Jesus as the Messiah, as the Savior, these were mature men. Yes, they probably still had a lot to learn, but it's not implausible that they would be the elders of congregations, and there was a tremendous Jewish population, and there could be elders that come forth of men out of these different former synagogues, so to speak. And so Paul exhorts them, the new disciples, the new Christians, and he encourages them. And then it tells us he basically retraces his retraces his path in verse 24 after they had passed through Pisidia and they came to Pamphylia. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. And from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God and the work which they completed. So they went all the way back to the starting point. And when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, so that they stayed there a long time with the disciples. Can you imagine the stories that Paul and Barnabas and them could tell after being gone 1 to 3 years? They came back. That's part of the reason why we invite people like Richard Bunner to come and speak to us after he's gone to Africa for 7 or 8 weeks, to come back and give us a report and let us know what happened. And on a quick side note, I'm almost out of time here. We have Richard Bunner came to us and asked for our support to go to South Africa, specifically to go to Johannesburg. Because when he was over in Johannesburg, South Africa, Johannesburg is a big, modern city in South Africa, the capital. I can't remember if it's the capital or not, but it's a big, modern city. And whenever you want to fly into the southern part of the African continent, you usually have to go through Johannesburg because it's got the big international hub there that services all those smaller African countries. But anyway, Richard Bunner is over there right now because there were 3 groups of Christians who migrated from Malawi and a few other places, but mainly Malawi, that they migrated down to Johannesburg for work, to find work and to have a better living. They immigrated, if you want to say that. And we had heard, we didn't know there weren't any established congregations in Johannesburg, and Richard heard about these people. He inquired, he got more information, and then he went and visited there. I believe it was last October. He found 3 groups of Christians worshiping correctly, but he also realized that they needed to be grounded in the faith even more because there were certain dangers that he also saw. So Richard asked for us to help him and to be funded to go and live in Johannesburg, and his wife will join him hopefully shortly, live there so that he can visit with these 3 groups of Christians and encourage them and ground them in the faith. And there are 3 what we would call new congregations there because of migration from Malawi and other areas. Just a quick side note there. So we look forward to getting his reports about that and coming into discussing that with us. There's a lot more I can say, but my time is gone, so we'll open it up for any additional comments by the male brethren. We'll start with you.
Well, I definitely appreciate your remarks. It's interesting to note, like you explained, he left Antioch, and you go back to the 13th chapter, the first part of it there, and the Holy Spirit told those leaders to separate Paul and Barnabas to do the work, and they sent them out. And then at the end of the missionary journey, they returned back to the church that sent them out and made the report to that church. And so we follow a similar example. When Richard goes over, we send him out, and then when he comes back, he reports back to his congregation. So we're sort of following that same pattern. But I'm not saying that, Richard's an evangelist and he's flexible, can go put work where he wants to. But when a congregation sends an evangelist out to do a foreign work, then to me, the biblical pattern is to go back to that congregation and give a report of your work. So I appreciate you pointing that out. I definitely appreciate your remarks.
Yes, I would like to just give a couple of additional passages to support what you said in the first segment of your lesson regarding the fact that as Paul was preaching in the synagogue, people, some became believers in what he said, but that was the whole purpose of some of the miracles. Let me give you two passages. In Mark, the 16th chapter, and verse 20, which is the last verse of the book of Mark, it says, "And they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them, confirming the word with signs following." Now, the miracles that Paul did, it was done to help to confirm the word, to validate he was a man of God, and he did that. Now, second verse that I won't read right now, but in John the 3rd chapter, the conversion of Nicodemus said, "Nobody can do the miracles you're doing unless God be with them." And so what you're reading and explaining tonight is excellent because it validates what had already happened and why these miracles were given. And souls were saved because of these miracles, and they became believers, they followed his word, and the church continued to grow and to mature.
And we have to understand that the Bible was not as we have it today. And so it had to be confirmed by God. And the scripture, what would become the letters that would make up the Bible.
Great job.
Teaching.
In verse 14, it's oftentimes, people talk about this in almost every commentary when they get to that point. That Barnabas and Paul are called apostles. Barnabas is not an apostle like Christ appointed witness. Paul was. He's an apostle in the sense that he's a messenger.
Right.
And in this particular verse, it's not even called Paul, it's referring to him as a messenger as well.
Yes.
Another thing that I appreciate very much your lesson is the fact that when we talk about these miracles, they see these things. I know in this chapter here, they wanted to make them gods. But when they rejected them, Barnabas and Paul told them, "We're men just like you." Well, now they're willing to take and kill them. And you're going to see that in chapter 16, that kind of attitude, even though there's miracles that happen, they don't get what they want, so they're going to kill them. And if you talk about Timothy there, I believe that Timothy about this time is about 18, somewhere around there. And like you said, he could have witnessed it. I just don't know. They just understand.
It is very interesting thought to think of that.
Yeah, because 1 Timothy 4:12 talks about the young man for 16 years roughly different. So he's still considered a young man, even at his 30.
This side. Okay. Thank you for your attention tonight. And I want to, before I give the invitation, I want to say that we have some open slots as we get into the latter chapter of Acts, for any of you men, teachers who want to take on a chapter, to me, it's a very interesting way to take a chapter and have to know it well enough where you can present it to others, but it helps you be focused. And so there's a sign-up sheet in the back, and we've got a few empty slots for the second half of Acts. And I'll give you a chance to get back there and claim a slot before I go back there and sign up for some more. Because I enjoy this. It's a lot of work, but it is enjoyable. We extend the invitation to any who is here, is not a baptized believer, as we say, to come and partake or become or be added to as a member of the church. And if you're here tonight and you're a baptized believer and you have sin in your life or you need to pray to the church, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.